Hey guys. Tonight we begin with the Roman Empire, where economics, power, and people were mixed into a system so casually brutal, it makes modern HR departments look saintly. So before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you truly enjoy what I do here. And let me know in the comments where you're tuning in from and what time it is for you. It's always fascinating to see who's joining us from around the world. Now, dim the lights, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. The story starts not in a palace or on a battlefield, but in a dusty, crowded square where the value of a human life was haggled over like a sack of grain. This was the Venelicium, the Roman slave market, a place that ran on a terrifying kind of efficiency. Forget resumes and interviews. Your entire worth was summarized on a small wooden plaque called a titulus hung around your neck. This little tag announced your origin, your skills, your age, and any defects the seller was legally required to disclose. Epilepsy, a tendency to run away, or a bad attitude, all fair game for the placard. It was a system of horrifying transparency. The main market in Rome was a sprawling, chaotic affair, often held near the Forum, close to the Temple of Castor and Pollux, but specialized markets existed everywhere. The island of Delos in Greece became infamous as a massive processing center, a place where, on a bad day, thousands of human beings could be bought and sold like livestock. Imagine the noise. A constant din of auctioneers, the sea precones, shouting prices, their voices cracking in the dry air. They were masters of ceremony, part showmen and part predators, gesturing wildly to chained families standing on raised wooden platforms. Below them, the crowd milled and pushed. Wealthy senators in clean white togas inspected bodies with cool detachment, while rougher men, perhaps agents for large farms, poked and prodded the merchandise. The air itself would have been an assault. The thick, cloying smell of sweat, unwashed bodies, and animal waste from the nearby food markets, all mixed with the expensive perfumes of the buyers. For the slaves, the feeling of the wooden platform under their bare feet, often cold and splintered, would be a sharp contrast to the sun beating down on their heads. They were often stripped naked to prove they had no hidden wounds or deformities, their bodies greased with oil to look healthier and more appealing under the sun's glare. A particularly strange and sad detail was the practice of whitening the feet of slaves imported from overseas with chalk. It was a label, like a sticker on fruit, marking them as fresh imports, new stock. The men who ran this trade, the mangones, were universally despised in Roman society, even in a culture that accepted slavery as a fact of life. The slave dealers were seen as the lowest of the low, parasites who profited from human misery. They were known for their tricks, dyeing gray hair black to make a slave seem younger, fattening up malnourished captives just before sale, or teaching them a few phrases of Greek to pass them off as educated. They were the used car salesmen of the ancient world, and everyone knew it. But they were a necessary part of the empire's engine. A buyer might poke a slave's stomach, check their teeth, or make them jump and run to test their wind. The sheer, dehumanizing pressure of that moment is hard to grasp. You are standing there, exposed to the world, while someone decides if your muscles are worth 2 years of a soldier's salary. The exhaustion would be profound, a bone-deep weariness from weeks of marching or being chained in a ship's hold, only to end up here, the object of a stranger's casual appraisal. The prices were, of course, all over the place. An unskilled laborer, a man strong enough for a farm or a mine, might fetch a price that a skilled artisan could save up. But the real money was in specialized skills. A slave who could read and write, especially in Greek, was an investment. A trained cook who knew how to prepare a 6-course banquet was a status symbol. Physicians, musicians, and beautiful attendants fetched astronomical sums. Their sales often conducted in quieter, more private settings away from the rabble of the main market. Historians still debate the sheer scale of the operation, particularly how many people were processed through hubs like Delos. Some ancient sources claim tens of thousands in a single day, which seems like an exaggeration, but it points to a trade that was staggering in its volume. This wasn't a small, hidden black market. It was a foundational pillar of the Roman economy, as visible and as accepted as the aqueducts or the Colosseum. And for the people standing on those platforms, the titulus around their neck wasn't just a price tag. It was the end of one life, and the beginning of an incredibly uncertain and likely brutal new one. Remember how we talked about those placards listing defects and skills? Well, before any of that happened, the merchandise first needed to be sourced. And in Rome, the source code for human labor was pure military might. Conquest was not just about bringing home gold and statues. It was about harvesting human capital on an industrial scale. War was Rome's favorite labor recruitment drive. When a legion conquered a territory, the survivors of the battle were instantly transformed from enemies of the state into its property. The moment the Roman commander declared victory, the living captives were rounded up and chained, often standing amidst the still smoking ruins of their homes. This experience was the ultimate sensory overload of trauma. Imagine the constant, acrid smell of burning wood and stale blood clinging to the air, mixing with the sharp, metallic tang of the new iron collar clamped around your neck. The silence after the fighting stopped must have been worse than the noise, punctuated only by the painful scraping sound of hundreds of heavy chains dragging against stone as you were marched toward the temporary holding pens. These temporary prisons, usually just fenced-off clearings or abandoned camps, were where the value judgment began. Leading generals were masters of this practice. Take Julius Caesar, for example. His campaigns in Gaul were less about bringing civilization to the barbarians and more about launching a massive human resource boom for Italy. Caesar was reportedly responsible for enslaving over 1 million people during his time there, a number that frankly makes modern logistics experts weep with envious horror. He didn't ship them all back personally. No, that would be inefficient. Instead, specialized dealers and Roman quaestors, the financial officers of the army, followed the legions like vultures. They bought the captives wholesale right there on the blood-soaked field, sometimes paying incredibly low bulk prices. It was a fire sale. Except the product was human beings fresh from the trauma of defeat. The sheer volume of these wartime captures meant the market was frequently flooded. A successful military campaign, especially one involving the destruction of a major city like Carthage or the great Iberian cities, could cause prices to plummet across the Mediterranean. If you were a middle-class Roman saving up for a decent house servant, the news that Caesar had just sold 10,000 Gauls at a steep discount was like hearing about a massive Black Friday sale on human beings. The value of a strong, healthy male slave could briefly dip below the cost of a fine tunic or a good bottle of wine. I'm not making this up. Economists back then, or at least the guys keeping the accounts, actually worried about the devaluation of human property because of this constant influx of cheap supply. This brings up a fascinating point that historians still debate whether the massive influx of cheap slave labor from conquest actually stifled technological innovation in Rome. Why invest time and money in inventing a machine, say a water-powered grain mill, when you could simply buy a dozen strong, exhausted men for less money and whip them to grind the flour all day long? The Roman efficiency was tragically simple. Human labor was the cheapest fuel they could find, and conquest was the eternal supplier. This meant that while Roman ingenuity gave us concrete and aqueducts, their dependence on free labor kept them from many labor-saving devices that would pop up later in history. The irony, of course, was that these cheap, wartime slaves were often the most dangerous. They were captured adults, not homeborn children. They knew how to fight. They understood tactics, and their motivation was not loyalty, but pure, burning rage. Plantation owners called latifundia owners would snap them up in bulk to work their vast estates and mines. They didn't care about their psychological state, only their raw output. But this constant stream of traumatized, battle-hardened men was the perfect kindling for revolt, a fire we will certainly get to later. For now, just remember that every smooth, oiled body sold at the forum market had a backstory written in the smoke and misery of a legionary victory. And that initial capture was usually the most terrifying moment of their life, marked by the constant, agonizing rub of the chain against their bone. The conquest of nations was the foundation on which the whole appalling system rested. Now we've established that war was the main pipeline filling the slave markets we looked at in Section 1. But not every enslaved person was dragged across the Alps by a legionary chain. For a system so integral to the economy, Rome needed multiple supply chains. And two of the most significant and most ethically opposed were the sudden terror of the high seas and the quiet tragedy of the Roman nursery. Let's talk first about the sea dogs. Pirates were the ultimate free market providers of human flesh, kidnapping anyone who looked remotely valuable. This wasn't just a few rogue boats. This was an industry, especially in the eastern Mediterranean, where the coasts of Cilicia became the global headquarters for organized human trafficking. Pirate fleets operated with terrifying efficiency, sweeping down on coastal towns or intercepting merchant vessels. The sensory experience of a pirate attack must have been instant, cold terror. The sound of sudden grappling hooks banging against the hull, the shouts in foreign languages, and then the sickening feeling of being dragged violently onto a deck slick with sea spray and fear. Once captured, the journey was horrific. Often packed below deck in the stench of bilge water, stale food, and the heavy salt air that stung every wound and dried every tear. These pirates had their favorite receiving hubs. And that little island we mentioned earlier, Delos, became the most infamous example. Ancient sources claim the pirates could dump tens of thousands of captives onto the Delian market in a matter of days, quickly liquidating their human cargo for gold before sailing out to find more. It was a terrifyingly efficient supply chain, a ruthless system that plucked individuals from all walks of life. Merchants, travelers, even Roman citizens, and fed them directly into the markets. You could literally be a wealthy free man one day, and a captive waiting for the chalk mark on your foot the next. It was the ultimate lottery of misfortune. But the most consistent and arguably most tragic source of new slaves came from within the Roman household itself. The Verni. These were the slaves born directly into servitude, the house brand of human property. If a mother was a slave, her children were automatically slaves, regardless of who the father was, even if the father was the master himself, which happened far too frequently. The master didn't have to buy them. They simply appeared, adding value to his estate with every birth. This gave the Verni a strange, dual status. On one hand, they were born into chains, never knowing freedom. On the other hand, they were often raised alongside the master's own children, learning the household rhythms, the family secrets, and the social graces needed to be a trusted attendant. For the Roman elite, a verna was generally considered more valuable than a foreign import. They lacked the trauma and resentment of a newly captured prisoner. They were loyal, or at least they were conditioned to appear loyal. And they were intimately familiar with the domestic life of the family. The air in the Dominus's nursery, where a Verna might be raised, would have been thick with the scent of lavender and expensive oils, a deceptive calm that masked the constant, subtle fear of living your entire life as someone else's property. This familiarity meant they were often placed in positions of great trust, as personal secretaries, accountants, or bedroom attendants. The cubiculari we will discuss later. An unusual legal detail shows just how bizarrely technical the Romans were about human property. Roman law stated that if a slave woman was freed while pregnant, the child would be born free, even if the mother was later re-enslaved. Conversely, if a woman who was free became pregnant, then was enslaved before the birth, the child would be born a slave. But here is the bizarre loophole. If the mother was free at any point during the pregnancy, the child would be born free. This legal maneuvering by jurists shows an absolute obsession with defining human status based on minute, legalistic timelines. A detail historians still debate the total percentage of the Roman slave population that was Verni versus foreign imports. The debate continues because calculating the fertility rates and survival chances of enslaved people is a dark, complex historical task. But it is clear that generation after generation of Vernae ensured the Roman system was self-sustaining. A quiet, internal tragedy mirroring the external violence of piracy and war. The large-scale pirate trade eventually faced its reckoning. In 67 BC, the Roman Senate, finally tired of having their grain ships seized and their officials kidnapped, gave Pompey the great, extraordinary power to eliminate the threat. This military event was an absolute game-changer. In a massive, coordinated campaign that lasted only a few months, Pompey systematically cleared the Mediterranean of the Cilician pirates. He captured hundreds of ships and thousands of pirates, and in a move that historians still admire for its efficiency, he often didn't execute the captured pirates. Instead, he resettled them in empty lands, turning them into farmers. This had two benefits. It removed the pirates from the sea, and it temporarily starved the slave markets of their primary non-military supply. It was a dramatic historical moment, a swift end to a century-old problem. But of course, it didn't end slavery itself. The demand for bodies was too high, and the profit too great. If the marketplace we talked about in Section 1 was the start of the journey, then this is where the vast majority of human labor ended up, and it was not pretty. We are talking about the unskilled masses, the strong but uneducated men and women swept up in wartime or piracy. They were cheap to acquire, often bought in bulk, and their destiny was usually one of two horrors. The massive agricultural estates known as latifundia, or the deep, dark heart of Rome's mines. Let's start with the absolute worst fate: the mines. The express lane to an early grave. If you were sold to a mine owner, you entered a world of suffocating dust and perpetual darkness. The major mining operations, whether for silver in Spain or iron in Gaul, relied on thousands of slave bodies driven by the raw, brutal necessity of extracting Rome's wealth. The work involved hacking at rock faces deep underground, often in tunnels barely wide enough to crawl through. The constant damp cold would seep into your bones, never to leave, and the air would be thick with stone dust and the fetid smell of human waste, creating a lethal, toxic mix. For the enslaved miner, the exhaustion was total. 12 to 14-hour shifts spent swinging a pickaxe in a cramped space. The only sound the rhythmic chipping of metal against stone, punctuated by the sharp crack of the overseer's whip. The constant feeling of the cold, rough stone walls pressing against your back was a perpetual reminder of the earth swallowing you whole. Life expectancy in the mines was measured in single-digit years. Once you were sent there, you were considered disposable, a human machine meant to work until your lungs gave out or the tunnel collapsed on you. They were chained while working, and sometimes even when they slept. The second, slightly less fatal destination was the latifundia. These were the massive, commercially focused farming estates, particularly common in southern Italy and Sicily. They were owned by the super-rich senatorial class and operated not with small personal teams, but with hundreds, sometimes thousands, of chained slave gangs. These estates were the backbone of Rome's food supply, producing vast amounts of grain, olive oil, and wine for the empire. The work was endless. From dawn to dusk, under the relentless Mediterranean sun, hacking at the earth with hose and scythe. Here, the sensory detail of life was dominated by the chain, the physical weight of slavery. Field slaves were often shackled together in groups, forced to walk and work in unison. The heavy iron chafing against their ankles and wrists would quickly wear through skin, leaving raw, open wounds, which became infected by the dust and dirt of the field. This constant pain, combined with the crushing heat, was the reality of the agricultural slave. And if the work was brutal, the rest was worse. These slaves were housed in ergastula, essentially large, underground prison barracks, which is a surprisingly odd detail. They were locked in at night, often still chained, to prevent escape and rebellion. The air in these underground cages would be thick with the stench of unwashed bodies, stale sweat, and cheap, sour wine doled out as a meager ration. The overseer, the villicus, controlled everything with an iron fist and a total absence of compassion. The sheer desperation created by these conditions led to one of the most significant historical events of the slave economy, the Servile Wars in Sicily. This was not a tiny skirmish. This was an open rebellion. In 135 BC, the slave gangs on the latifundia rose up, driven by starvation and abuse. Led by a Syrian slave named Eunice, who claimed prophetic powers, the revolt quickly swelled into a massive army that defeated Roman forces and held parts of Sicily for years. It was a terrifying reminder to the Roman elite that their cheap labor source was also their greatest internal threat, a fear that would peak again later with Spartacus. This leads to another interesting point that historians still debate whether free tenant farmers called coloni were economically more efficient than mass slave gangs on the latifundia. While the slave gangs were theoretically cheaper because you didn't pay wages, the free farmers had a personal stake in the harvest and tended to maintain the land better. The debate centers on long-term agricultural sustainability versus immediate, brutal profit. Rome ultimately leaned toward immediate profit, prioritizing the huge scale of slave gangs. But the price, as the Sicilian revolt showed, was paid not only in blood, but in constant, simmering fear. For the average unskilled slave, their whole life was defined by the relentless cycle of work, pain, and the suffocating smell of the ergastulum at night. If the unskilled slave we discussed in the last section was cheap, disposable labor for the sweaty fields, then the educated slave was a high-end luxury good, an investment wrapped in a toga. We are talking about the Greek tutors, the physicians, the scribes, and the administrators who formed the intelligent, administrative core of the Roman elite's vast estates. These were not the men you bought with a handful of sesterces after a battle. These were the men you paid a fortune for, sometimes fetching prices that rivaled the cost of a working villa with a vineyard. The cruel irony here is essential to grasp. Rome was obsessed with Greek culture, its philosophy, its art, its history. Yet, the people who actually carried that knowledge, the philosophers and teachers, were often enslaved Greeks, shipped back to Rome and sold like philosophical Swiss army knives. Owning one was the ultimate status symbol, a way for a newly rich Roman to project instant culture without actually having to read Plato himself. It was a classic Roman move: love the culture, enslave the creators. It's like buying an AI assistant that can write poetry, but you have to keep it in a locked cupboard when you're not using it. These skilled slaves had specialized roles that placed them at the very heart of the master's personal and financial life. The pedagogus, the child's tutor and moral guardian, was particularly important. This slave was responsible for supervising the master's children, teaching them Greek, Latin, rhetoric, and all the graces required of a future senator. Here is an oddly specific detail. The pedagogus had a great deal of authority, often more than the mother, even administering discipline to the young freeborn master. Imagine a slave being entrusted with shaping the mind and morals of the child who would one day legally own him. It created a fascinating, deeply conflicted relationship built on respect, dependence, and the ever-present reality of bondage. For the wealthy, a skilled slave was absolutely critical for managing their complex lives. They acted as accountants, tracking complicated finances and rent payments from vast properties. They served as personal secretaries, hunched over low tables, their only sound the gentle, dry rustle of papyrus scrolls being carefully unrolled and copied, the faint, earthy smell of ink clinging to the air around the library. A skilled physician, often Greek, could literally save the master's life, leading to high prices and occasionally better treatment. These elite slaves were often dressed in finer wool robes than the average Roman citizen, their clothes soft and expensive, a physical representation of their value to the household. The most dramatic event that boosted this particular segment of the slave market was the Roman conquest of Greece itself, particularly the destruction of Corinth in 146 BC, which marked the final military subjugation of the Greek heartland. Suddenly, the defeated cities provided a massive influx of learned, cultivated people, educated elite captured in mass. It was a windfall of intellect for the Roman upper class, a cultural acquisition as important as the looted statues that started appearing in Roman villas. Historians still debate whether the reliance on educated Greek slaves ultimately made the Roman upper class intellectually lazy. Why strive to master philosophy or accounting when you could simply purchase a human brain guaranteed to be smarter than yours for a hefty fee? Some academics argue that this dependence on intellectual servitude ultimately stunted Rome's own academic development, creating an elite that was more concerned with the appearance of culture than its actual pursuit. The irony continues. The Romans conquered Greece physically, but remained culturally captive to the very people they placed in chains. For these high-value slaves, life was safer than the mines. But their bondage was perhaps more psychologically acute, forced to use their superior intellect every day to serve a master they often considered their intellectual inferior. The chains were invisible, but they were certainly there. Let's pull the camera away from the fields and the mines and step inside the elite Roman domus or villa. For the wealthy, the home was not just a place to live. It was a stage for displaying status. And the props on that stage were people, hundreds of highly specialized male domestic slaves. The labor here was not backbreaking in the way of the latifundia, but it was relentless, intimate, and often psychologically exhausting. If you were a domestic slave, you were not just a worker. You were a human cog in a finely tuned machine of luxury and ego. The specialization was genuinely absurd. A massive house didn't just have a cook. It had a kitchen staff that included a fish cook, a meat cook, a dessert specialist, and the procurator who managed the grocery budget. You had the ostiari, the doorkeepers, men who spent their lives standing by the great bronze door, their world defined by the distant, specific sounds of the city outside, the clatter of a passing chariot or the muffled shouts of vendors, sounds they were rarely allowed to join. There were the lecticiari, the strong-backed men who carried the master through the streets on his litter. and the Atrienses, who supervised the vast public hall, ensuring the floor was polished so perfectly that the cool, hard marble reflected the light like water. The most intimate and arguably most powerful role was the cubicularius, the chamber slave or bedroom attendant. This slave lived in constant, close proximity to the master. They managed his wardrobe, helped him dress every morning, and were present for the unguarded moments before and after sleep. Imagine helping your master into his toga. The metallic, stale smell of his morning breath hitting your face as you tied the complicated folds of the cloth. The cubicularius knew the master's schedules, his mistresses, his debts, and his deepest secrets. This knowledge brought high status within the slave hierarchy, but it also made them desperately vulnerable. They were often showered with gifts and trust, yet a misplaced word or a moment of perceived disloyalty could lead to a severe, private punishment. Perhaps the strangest, most specific job was held by the nomenclator. This man had one job and one job only: to accompany the master in public and whisper the names of every person they encountered into the master's ear. Rome's social life was based on patronage and hierarchy, so forgetting a senator's name or confusing a client could be a serious social blunder. The nomenclator was a living memory aid, a slave who was purchased specifically for his ability to retain biographical data, ensuring his master always appeared gracious and politically connected. It is a detail that really highlights the bizarre, luxurious excess of the Roman elite. A constant stream of information being murmured into their ear. This extreme proximity to power occasionally led to dramatic historical events. While emperors were rarely killed by a field slave, they were often murdered by their personal, trusted cubiculari. Take the case of Emperor Commodus, the famously erratic and gladiator-obsessed ruler. In 192 AD, Commodus was strangled in his bath. Who helped plot his downfall? Not the Senate, but his mistress, his chamberlain, and his physical trainer, all of whom were highly placed in his intimate domestic circle. His cubicularius was crucial in the plot because he alone knew when the emperor was truly vulnerable, providing the access needed to end the tyrant's reign. This event perfectly illustrates the double-edged sword of domestic service, a path to relative comfort, but also a ticket to the highest-stakes political drama. The relationship between master and slave in this setting remains fascinating, and historians still debate the true extent to which domestic slaves acted as informal power brokers. These slaves, through their sheer access, could control who saw the master and when, filtering information and influencing decisions. They were silent witnesses and secret gatekeepers, often holding more real power over the household than free-born relatives. While they wore the rough, plain wool livery of servitude, a constant, itchy reminder of their status. Their proximity to wealth and power made the Roman domus a tense, complicated world of whispers, ambition, and constant, subtle rivalry. Moving through the intimate spaces of the Roman domus, we next find the realm of female servitude, a world defined by domestic necessity and intense vulnerability. While male slaves ran the business and attended the master, female slaves, the ancilli, were the domestic backbone, responsible for everything from childcare to cleaning. Their work was quieter than the shouting of the auctioneer or the rhythmic clang of the mine, but it was ceaseless and often carried a high emotional cost. The primary hub of female labor was often the textrinum, the household weaving room. The smell in this room would have been thick with the warm, lanolin scent of raw wool and the dry dust of flax. The constant background noise was the relentless, hypnotic clack-clack-clack of the vertical looms, a sound that dominated the daily life of the textresses or weavers. Their work was absolutely essential. Roman women did not buy clothes off the rack. so everything the family wore, from the senator's expensive toga to the children's tunics, was made by enslaved hands. This labor was tedious, repetitive, and constantly monitored, and mistakes in the delicate thread count or pattern often resulted in sharp punishment. Beyond weaving, certain female roles carried immense emotional weight. The nutrix, the wet nurse, was one such position. She was responsible for breastfeeding the master's freeborn children, a role of immense trust and intimacy that required her to put the survival of another woman's child ahead of her own. The Roman nursery would have had a distinct, milky, sweet smell, a small island of warmth in the cool marble house. But the nutrix lived with a deep, emotional paradox, providing love and life to a child who would one day own her. Historians still debate the degree to which female slaves exerted power through their role as wet nurses, potentially gaining emotional leverage or influence over the children of the elite that lasted into their adulthood. A subtle but significant way to push back against their bondage. Another highly specialized and surprisingly stressful job was that of the ornatrix, the hairdresser. These women were artists of the hair, tasked with creating the famously complex, towering, gravity-defying hairstyles favored by elite Roman women. This is a wonderfully bizarre detail. Mistakes were not tolerated. A stray curl or a misplaced pin could lead to severe beatings, even though the task was entirely superficial, proving that Roman vanity was a high-stakes affair. The ornatrix worked with sharp implements and cosmetics that had a faint metallic smell, operating under the intense, unblinking scrutiny of her mistress. But the central reality for female slaves was their intense vulnerability. Unlike their male counterparts, they were constantly exposed to the threat of sexual exploitation. In the Roman worldview, the body of the slave was property, and the master had absolute rights over it. Auctioneers often used euphemisms in sales to hint at a woman's suitability for concubinage or sexual services, describing her as pulchra forma, or of beautiful form. This constant threat of unwanted attention and violence defined their experience, making their lives a precarious balance between obedience, usefulness, and the desperate hope for invisibility. The historical event that shows Rome trying, however inefficiently, to manage the social chaos created by this reality was the legislation passed by Emperor Augustus. He was less concerned with morality and more concerned with social order. Augustus introduced laws regulating the manumission of slaves, particularly those who bore their masters' children. He wanted to ensure that the growing number of freed slaves, the liberti, and their offspring were integrated into society in an orderly way. This was a classic Roman move, not banning the exploitation, but creating complicated legal hoops for the consequences. It proved that the ruling class knew perfectly well the extent of the problem they had created, even if their solution was about paperwork rather than humanity. For the enslaved woman, her life was a tightrope, balanced between the demanding clack of the loom and the soft, constant fear of the master's quiet command. We've seen that skill and training could send a slave's price soaring. But there was one other factor that transcended education or strength: pure, raw, physical appearance. In the Roman slave market, beauty was the ultimate premium commodity, often fetching prices that rivaled an entire estate, not because the person could cure a disease or manage an army, but simply because they looked good while pouring the wine or attending the master. This was the most dehumanizing segment of the trade, reducing a human being entirely to an object of aesthetic pleasure and personal gratification. Young women, destined for the role of concubine or palex, were particularly vulnerable to this cruel valuation. They were often sourced from specific regions, like Syria, Egypt, or Thrace, each believed to possess a particular kind of exotic charm that Roman buyers found fashionable. Their price tags were astronomical, reflecting not just their physical features, but the bragging rights they conferred upon the owner. Owning a beautiful concubine was the Roman equivalent of driving a gold-plated chariot, a flagrant display of wealth that whispered to the entire world, "I can afford the absolute best, even if it is a person." The market also placed immense value on pueri delicati, literally choice boys, or delicia. These attractive young male slaves were purchased to serve as cupbearers, personal attendants, or companions. Like the female concubines, they were treated as walking works of art, objects of display, and their value was entirely tied to their youth and symmetrical features. The dealer, the mango, specialized in preparing these high-value slaves for sale. They would be bathed in scented oils, sometimes dressed in fine, imported silk or linen, and perfumed with heady, expensive scents that made the rough smell of the marketplace momentarily fade away. The chilling sound in these private sales rooms was the calm, measured voice of the dealer announcing a price of 60,000 sesterces for a young, terrified boy. The number delivered with the same nonchalance one might use to order a cup of water. This market was so lucrative that specialized dealers existed who dealt exclusively in such luxury goods, often operating out of discreet backrooms or private apartments rather than the chaotic public forum. This is an odd detail. A whole economy built around trafficking the attractive, young, carefully curated for an elite clientele who wanted their exploitation delivered with a veneer of class and privacy. The entire transaction was governed by the assumption that the slave's body was the master's property, a painful legal reality that allowed the elite to normalize non-consensual sexual exploitation. While there were laws like the Edict of the Aedeles that required sellers to disclose health defects, like epilepsy or a tendency to run away, there was no protection against the life the buyer intended for the purchase. The law concerned itself with the physical condition of the commodity, not the moral fate of the person. The constant demand for beauty, institutionalized by the slave trade, raises a profound question that historians still debate: the extent to which the demand for attractive slaves normalized and institutionalized non-consensual sexual exploitation across all levels of Roman society. Did the legal right of a master to use their slave as they saw fit bleed into the perceived social right of any free Roman man to view and treat any enslaved person as an object for his gratification? This cultural acceptance, built on the physical feeling of fine, expensive robes and the heady smell of perfume, was perhaps the most enduring and corrosive legacy of this segment of the slave market. For the person sold for their looks, their price was not a measure of talent, but a sentence of total objectification. We shift now from the quiet, private cruelties of the bedroom and the textrinum to the loudest, most public face of Roman slavery, the arena. The gladiator was the most extreme financial gamble a Roman investor could make, a living, breathing paradox of fame and bondage. These were men, and occasionally women, whose value rested entirely on their ability to entertain thousands by killing or narrowly avoiding being killed. Their cost was astronomical, sometimes exceeding the price of the most skilled Greek physician or the most beautiful concubine. Gladiators were essentially professional athletes purchased, owned, and controlled by trainers called lanistai. These dealers ran specialized schools, the ludi, which were part prison and part gym, where the slaves were trained in specific fighting styles. Life inside the ludus was brutally disciplined, governed by an austere diet, constant training, and the ever-present threat of the whip. The discovery of the gladiator barracks at Pompeii, a specific historical event that allowed us to peek behind the curtain, revealed small confining rooms surrounding a central training yard, confirming that even the most famous fighters lived under strict, prison-like conditions, constantly monitored and guarded. The paradox of the gladiator's life was truly bizarre. Once they stepped onto the sand, the arena, they became instant celebrities. The overwhelming raw sound of the crowd, the deafening collective roar of tens of thousands of Roman citizens baying for blood, was the engine of their fame. They had groupies, fan clubs, and their likenesses were etched onto oil lamps and water jugs. This strange status was amplified by the highly detailed advertising that surrounded the games. This is an odd detail. Walls throughout Roman cities were plastered with painted announcements, like ancient posters, promising specific death matches and celebrating the victories of certain fighters like Flamma or Spiculus. It was the world's first celebrity death sport, and the performers were owned property. For the slave gladiator, the sensory experience of the arena was unlike any other. The air was thick with the copper metallic smell of fresh blood, mixing with the dry, absorbent sawdust of the fighting surface, a scent that must have instantly signaled death. Then there was the armor, the feeling of the heavy, cold bronze of the helmet pressing down, restricting your vision, and the thick leather straps of the greaves chafing your legs. Yet, with that heavy armor came a strange sense of temporary power. A brief moment where their destiny was in their own hands, or at least in their sword arm. This fame, however, came with an immediate and terrible cost. No matter how many cheering fans they had, they were still slaves. Their bodies were not their own, and every victory was merely a temporary reprieve. A wound that might end a free man's career could end a gladiator's life, costing the lanista a fortune. Their bondage was the engine of their celebrity. This unique social position leads to a question historians still debate: the true social status of the gladiator. Were they, by virtue of their fame and the occasional chance of manumission after a successful, long career, elevated above other slaves? Some scholars argue that the public adoration and the chance to earn money, or peculium, made them a distinct, privileged caste within the slave system. Others maintain that because they were forced to risk death for public amusement, they were actually the most degraded of all slaves, men legally defined as human sacrifice to Roman spectacle. Regardless of where they fell on the ladder, they walked a razor's edge, constantly balancing the roar of the crowd with the absolute silence of the grave. A testament to the fact that in Rome, even your death could be bought and sold for a profit. We've spent a lot of time looking at the slaves owned by individuals, the senators, the farmers, and the lanistae. But the largest, and in some ways the most stable slave owner in Rome, was the state itself. These were the servi publici, public slaves, men and women owned not by a single dominus, but by the Roman people, the res publica, or later, by the emperor, in which case they were known as Caesaris servi. This form of servitude came with a weird, ironic set of advantages, because working for the bureaucracy was often better than working for a person. The servi publici were the invisible backbone of Rome's legendary infrastructure and administration. They were the men who maintained the aqueducts, swept the temples, handled the public finances, and kept the imperial archives running. If a private slave's life was subject to the whims, temper, and financial fortunes of his individual master, a public slave's life was subject to the whims of the Senate, which, while still chaotic, offered a strange kind of job security. The state had endless projects and needed reliable, specialized labor that couldn't simply be whipped to death on a private whim. Imagine the work involved in maintaining the aqueducts, the lifeblood of Rome. These slaves were part of the maintenance crews, often working deep underground in the cool, wet feeling of the stone tunnels, inspecting the water channels to ensure the flow was constant and clean. The sheer scale of the task was immense, and the expertise required meant these slaves were highly skilled in masonry, engineering, and hydraulics. We know much about their work thanks to people like Sextus Julius Frontinus, the water commissioner, a historical figure who described the vast and organized crew of slaves dedicated solely to keeping the city's water supply flowing. A dedicated public labor force ensuring the health of the citizens who owned them. Other public slaves worked in clerical roles, managing the massive state documents stored in the tabularium, the public records office. These men were scribes, administrators, and accountants, dealing with complex legal and financial records. Their work environment was drastically different from the dusty, chaotic marketplace we saw earlier. Here, the air would have been thick with the smell of old papyrus and dust, and the main sound would be the soft, hollow echo of their footsteps on the stone floors as they moved through the vast halls containing centuries of Roman history. These were white-collar slaves, often granted a higher degree of trust and autonomy than the average household slave. One oddly specific detail that marked their unique status was their livery. Public slaves sometimes wore distinctive state uniforms or badges, marking them as property of the Senate or the emperor. This gave them a strange, quasi-official authority. They could order free citizens to move during public works or access areas restricted to private individuals. It was an authority derived entirely from their status as property of the highest power, giving the public slave a dignity entirely absent from the life of a slave on a latifundia. They were still slaves, of course, but their chains were gilded with a thin layer of officialdom. Their path to freedom was also often clearer. The state recognized the value of encouraging loyalty among its skilled personnel. So servipublics sometimes had a standardized route to manumission, freedom, often after a set number of years or successful completion of a major project. This leads to a complex question historians still debate: whether the use of servipublici in specialized bureaucratic roles essentially influenced the later development of the imperial civil service. Some scholars argue that these state slaves formed the functional core of the empire's early bureaucracy, establishing the systems and precedents that would later be adopted by free citizens, proving that even a system built on total exploitation could inadvertently lay the groundwork for a future administrative state. For these slaves, the quiet satisfaction of seeing a massive public project like a new road or a maintained aqueduct was their small, ironic legacy, built by hands that were not their own, but served the collective. We have seen the different jobs, the prices, and the sources of slaves. But now, we must confront the cold, unyielding foundation of the entire system. The law. Regardless of whether a slave was a skilled physician or a shackled miner, their legal status was identical and terrifyingly simple. They were res, a thing, a piece of chattel, not a persona, a legal person. In the eyes of Rome, you were property, no different from a chariot, a tool, or an amphora of wine. This was the dark core of the Roman experiment. This legal definition placed the slave entirely under the dominium, the absolute power of the dominus, the master. In the early republic, this power extended to life and death. A master could legally kill his slave with impunity. And while later imperial law introduced some small, largely cosmetic restrictions, the practical reality remained brutal. A slave could not testify against their master, could not own property, and could not enter into a contract. Any savings they accumulated, the peculium that we will discuss soon, were technically still the master's property, merely entrusted to the slave's management. This lack of legal personhood affected every aspect of a slave's life, even their most intimate relationships. A slave could not legally marry, the Roman state refusing to recognize their unions. Their cohabitation was called contubernium, an oddly clinical word that meant simply a dwelling together. This is a strange and deeply sad detail. A slave couple could live together for decades, raise children, and share every hardship, but they were still, legally speaking, unmarried. their family unit subject to being instantly dissolved if the master decided to sell one or the other. The feeling of absolute helplessness that must have permeated the slave community. The knowledge that any moment, without warning, your entire life could be shattered by a single arbitrary command is palpable even across the centuries. Imagine the cold sweat that must have broken out on a slave's brow as he watched a fellow slave punished brutally for a minor infraction, knowing his life was equally cheap and equally disposable. The sheer ruthlessness of this legal framework was demonstrated in a shocking historical event that took place in 61 AD. Lucius Pedanius Secundus, the prefect of Rome, was murdered by one of his domestic slaves. The ancient law dictated that in such a case, every slave in the household at the time, regardless of guilt or innocence, must be executed. When the Senate debated this measure, some senators argued for mercy for the 400 domestic slaves involved, including women and children. But the majority upheld the grim letter of the law. The punishment was carried out, and all 400 slaves were executed. This was not just punishment. It was a terrifying public display of the law, a clear message to the entire slave population that their individual lives meant nothing compared to the maintenance of the dominus's power. The unforgiving, sharp smell of the legal wax tablets that contained this cruel statute must have been the scent of pure injustice to those who understood its content. This legal rigidity leads to a profound academic question that historians still debate the extent to which Stoic and later imperial philosophies truly influenced the reduction of the master's power over life and death. Later emperors introduced laws making the arbitrary killing of a slave illegal. But scholars argue whether this was genuine moral progress driven by thinkers like Seneca, or simply a pragmatic move by the state to protect valuable human capital from impulsive, destructive owners. If a slave was expensive, it made poor economic sense to let an angry master destroy that asset. The shift was less about changing the status of the slave as res, and more about managing the economy of human property. A subtle but critical distinction that kept the system humming efficiently, regardless of any high-minded philosophical musings. We've seen the law's unforgiving might in the last section, defining the slave as mere property. But no legal decree can extinguish the human spirit. The vast majority of resistance to Roman slavery was not fought with swords in the arena or on the battlefield, but in quiet, daily acts of defiance. This was the silent war, a constant low-level rebellion fought in the fields, kitchens, and mines, designed to make the master's ownership less profitable and far more frustrating. Passive resistance was the bread and butter of this silent war. It included feigning stupidity or illness. Imagine the pervasive, dull ache of chronic, faked back pain, a tool used by the slave to reduce their workload and exasperate the overseer. Tools might be broken through clumsy handling. Grain might be accidentally mixed with stones. Work would be done at the deliberately slow pace that we would now call malicious compliance. This constant, subtle sabotage forced masters and overseers to spend vast amounts of time and energy supervising their property, eroding the precious efficiency the whole system was built upon. The most active form of daily resistance was, of course, running away. These runaway slaves, or fugitivi, were a massive, pervasive problem for Rome, a constant drain on the slave population, and a profound insult to the master's honor. Escaping was incredibly difficult. The slave had no identity papers, and the entire Roman world, from the Alps to Alexandria, was structured to identify and return them. Slave catchers, or fugitivarii, were professional mercenaries who specialized in hunting down runaways for reward, aided by official warrants and rewards posted across the empire. The evidence of this problem and Rome's desperate attempts to solve it remains shockingly physical. We know about the existence of the slave collar, a specific historical artifact that perfectly illustrates this brutal reality. Recaptured runaways were sometimes fitted with heavy iron collars that were locked around the neck, featuring a metal tag that clearly stated the slave's name, their master's name, and instructions on where to return them. Imagine the chilling, dry, metallic feel of that iron collar clamped around your neck, a constant, heavy reminder that you were hunted property, a burden the unfortunate slave would have to wear until death. The tag sometimes included a grim, sarcastic plea: "Flee, or you will be returned to the master." When a fugitivus was recaptured, the punishment was often horrific, intended to deter others. An oddly gruesome detail was the practice of branding the slave with hot irons, often on the forehead. The letter used was usually F for fugitivus, a permanent, searing mark that guaranteed they would never be able to pass as a free person again. The smell of fear, desperation, and the faint, coppery scent of the slave's own blood must have been thick in the holding pens where they awaited their fate. A fate dictated by their master's need to make an example of them. This daily struggle, the persistent economic drag caused by resistance, leads to an interesting academic question that historians still debate: the effectiveness of passive resistance. Was the economic damage caused by slow work, broken tools, and the sheer cost of chasing down and branding runaways more significant in the long term than the occasional, spectacular violence of a full-scale revolt? Some argue that this constant, hidden attrition of capital, the small acts of defiance that permeated every kitchen and field, may have been the truest, most enduring form of slave resistance against the Roman economic machine. For the master, a subtle act of sabotage was simply frustrating. But for the slave, it was a tiny, hard-won victory in a life otherwise defined by total submission. We've talked about the quiet forms of resistance, the broken tools, and the feigned sickness. But sometimes, the simmering rage and desperation of the enslaved masses boiled over into open war. This brings us to the most spectacular and terrifying chapter in the history of Roman slavery: the Servile Wars. These were not just riots. They were full-scale military uprisings, massive wars fought on Italian soil where the Roman elite stared into the abyss of having their entire world overturned by the very people they owned. The most famous of these uprisings, and the one that truly traumatized Rome, was the Third Servile War, led by the Thracian gladiator Spartacus. In 73 BC, Spartacus and around 70 other gladiators escaped from a training school in Capua, seizing kitchen knives and tools, a small spark that quickly ignited into a raging inferno. The sound of their hastily forged weapons, the chaotic, high-pitched ringing as they pounded scrap metal into crude swords and spears, must have become the new, terrifying music of the South Italian countryside. What began as a tiny band of gladiators quickly swelled into a massive army of desperate slaves, numbering perhaps 70,000 or more at its peak. They included field slaves escaping the brutality of the latifundia and house slaves seeking liberty, all united by a common chain. The sight of a slave army, a rabble of the broken and the defiant, marching through the heart of Italy, defeating multiple hastily assembled Roman armies, sent a profound shiver of fear through the entire ruling class. The constant smell of desperation and fear, not from the slaves, but from the Roman landowners watching their villas burn, was the true cost of the uprising. The success of Spartacus was rooted in his military discipline, but his army faced an impossible challenge: the sheer diversity of its members. This is an oddly specific detail. Historians note that Spartacus's forces were composed of men and women speaking dozens of different languages, including Thracian, Gallic, Germanic, and Greek. This linguistic chaos made command, cohesion, and long-term organization a massive undertaking, a factor that ultimately contributed to their downfall. Imagine trying to coordinate a battle strategy when half your commanders can't understand the simple command to charge or retreat. The historical event that brutally ended the war was the confrontation with Marcus Licinius Crassus, Rome's wealthiest man, who raised a massive, disciplined army. After trapping the slave army in southern Italy, Crassus ultimately crushed the revolt, and the vengeance was horrific and unforgettable. To punish the slaves and send a chilling, visible warning to the entire slave population, Crassus had 6,000 captured slaves crucified. The sight was the most powerful statement of Roman power imaginable. The long, straight line of the Appian Way, one of Rome's most important roads, was lined with crosses for miles, a grim, unending forest of dead and dying bodies. The feeling of the heavy wooden cross, the sharp, agonizing burn of the nails, and the slow, public death by exposure became the ultimate symbol of Rome's response to rebellion. Despite the brutal end, the memory of Spartacus never faded. His name became synonymous with rebellion and hope for the enslaved, a haunting specter for the masters. This enduring legacy leads to a question historians still debate Spartacus's ultimate goal. Did he genuinely intend to lead his army out of Italy, perhaps across the Alps to their homelands? Or did he, in the end, realize the impossibility of escape and decide to make a last stand to overthrow the entire Roman state? His exact motivations remain unclear, but his revolt proved one terrifying truth. The system of Roman slavery was a volcano, and even the slightest tremor could signal a catastrophic eruption. The fear of another Spartacus haunted Roman politics and policy for centuries afterward. After the terror of the Servile Wars, the vast majority of enslaved people clung not to the hope of rebellion, but to the quieter, harder hope of freedom. Manumissio. This was the ultimate prize, the legal transformation from res to persona. It wasn't always a gift of sudden benevolence. Often it was an economic transaction, a long-term contract fulfilled. A slave could be freed in three main ways: by a master's will upon his death, by a formal declaration in front of a magistrate, or most commonly, by buying themselves. This self-purchase was made possible by one of the strangest, most ironic institutions in the whole system, the peculium. This was a small, legally recognized fund of money, savings accumulated by the slave, sometimes through tips from guests, sometimes by being allowed to keep a small profit from a side business or a trade. Technically, the peculium belonged entirely to the master, who could legally seize it at any moment. But practically, it was often left alone, functioning as a powerful incentive for the slave to work harder and smarter. For the slave, the physical feeling of a silver coin in their hand, cool and heavy, was the most tangible form of hope they possessed. A small, shimmering piece of liberty being saved one sestertius at a time. A slave could use this peculium to buy their own freedom by offering the master a price equal to their market value. It was like paying off a mortgage on your own soul. For a successful scribe or a trusted administrator, the process could take years or even decades. A relentless accumulation of wealth through hard work and frugality. The master benefited because he got a large lump sum of cash for an asset he might otherwise have had to feed and clothe for years. Plus, he often retained the freed person's loyalty and labor as an ongoing client. This system produced one of the most bizarre and morally confusing details of Roman slavery. Highly skilled slaves who had accumulated a large peculium were sometimes allowed to own slaves of their own, called vicari. These vicari worked for their slave owner, helping them generate more income to eventually buy their own freedom. The concept of a slave owning a slave perfectly illustrates the moral convolutions required to keep the Roman economy running. A man in chains could benefit from the chains of another man. A cruel paradox that helped fund the slave's ultimate goal. The state, however, was always wary of too much social change. The historical event that illustrates this caution was the legislation passed by Emperor Augustus. By the early imperial period, masters were freeing slaves at such a rate that Roman society grew concerned about the influx of large numbers of new citizens with foreign backgrounds. To control this, Augustus passed the Lex Fufia Caninia in 200 BC and the Lex Aelia Sentia in 4 AD. Laws that restricted the number of slaves a master could free in his will based on the size of his slaveholdings. These laws proved that the state viewed manumissio not as a moral good, but as a political lever to be managed, ensuring that the number of new freedmen did not destabilize the existing social order. This whole process raises a key question that historians still debate, whether peculium was a benevolent tool for social mobility, or a sophisticated mechanism used by masters to incentivize productivity and shift financial risk onto the slave. By giving the slave the illusion of ownership and the hope of freedom, the master essentially outsourced management and motivation, making the slave a self-policing, highly productive asset, regardless of the intent. For the slave, the moment their owner accepted the final payment, the moment the heavy scent of the master's wine at the celebratory dinner could be enjoyed without the choking reminder of servitude, and the moment the iron collar or chain was finally removed, was the moment of their rebirth, a complicated, hard-won freedom. So the final payment is made, the master utters the ritual words, and the chain falls away. The slave is no longer res, but persona, a freedman or libertus. This moment of manumissio was the start of a new life, but it was not the end of the story, not by a long shot. The freedman immediately entered a complicated social world, where freedom came with a hefty set of obligations and a thick social stigma that clung to him like cheap perfume. The first and most enduring reality was the continuation of the master-slave relationship in a new, legally codified form. The former master became the freedman's patronus, or patron, and the freedman owed him lifelong duty. This duty included obsequium, a deep, ingrained respect and deference that meant the freedman dared not speak ill of his patron or challenge him in any way. He also owed operae, specified days of labor or service, often written into the manumission contract, ensuring the patron still received some work for his initial investment. Imagine the lingering, anxious taste of deference in the libertus's mouth every time he addressed his former owner. A subservience that was no longer enforced by chains, but by law and social custom. Despite having full Roman citizenship in most cases, the freedman was severely limited socially. They could not hold the highest political offices, the magistracies, nor could they join the senatorial elite. They carried a permanent mark of their servile past, often reflected in their speech, the sound of their foreign-accented Latin immediately betraying their origin as an imported slave. This social stigma was a quiet, constant reminder that while they were free, they were not truly equal. However, their very freedom allowed them to pursue economic avenues that were beneath the dignity of the old Roman nobility. They flocked into commerce, trade, and crafts, becoming bakers, shippers, bankers, and large-scale builders. Many became fabulously wealthy, easily outstripping their patrons' financial fortunes. The historical event that best exemplifies this staggering social and economic rise is the career of Pallas, a Greek freedman who served Emperor Claudius. Pallas rose to become the emperor's imperial secretary of the treasury, essentially controlling the finances of the entire empire. He amassed a fortune so immense that he was once offered the robes of a praetor, an ancient political office. But he refused, preferring the quiet power of the bureaucracy. This rise shows that while the patrician ranks were closed, the new cash-rich ranks of imperial administration and commerce were wide open, creating a powerful, wealthy, and often resented class of formerly enslaved men. The enduring irony, and this is an oddly wonderful detail, was the gift of delayed social mobility. While the liberatus carried the stigma of slavery, his children were born free and clear. A freedman's son could, and often did, rise to the highest offices, serving in the Senate, commanding legions, and becoming fully integrated into the Roman elite. This created a strange kind of social engine, a constant supply of motivated, commercially skilled people being injected into the Roman bloodstream, a kind of generational amnesty that allowed the wealth accumulated by the father to buy the status of the son. This vast, complex system of bondage, freedom, and delayed social mobility leads us to the final academic question historians still debate: the true economic legacy of Roman slavery. Did the institution of slavery ultimately cause the long-term stagnation of the Roman economy by stifling innovation and creating massive income inequality? Or was the freedmen's aggressive, entrepreneurial spirit a vital economic force that helped the empire sustain itself for centuries longer than it should have? The truth is likely somewhere in the middle, a messy blend of oppression and innovation that ultimately built the roads, baked the bread, and managed the scrolls of the world's most enduring empire. The sheer scale of the system, its brutality, its contradictions, and its unexpected paths to dignity and wealth define the history of Rome as much as any emperor or legionary victory. The feeling of that first free breath, inhaled by the liberatus as he wrapped himself in the coarse wool of his new citizen's toga, was paid for not just in silver, but in the lost lives and endless toil of the millions who never knew that final liberty. And now, as the night deepens and the journey through ancient Rome draws to a close, let's allow the dust of the forum and the metallic clang of the arena to fade into silence. We began tonight in the glare of the slave market, where a life was reduced to a price tag. And we followed the journey of the enslaved from the terror of wartime capture to the quiet horror of the mines, from the sophisticated bondage of the learned tutor to the dangerous paradox of the famous gladiator. We saw the unforgiving power of Roman law, which defined a person as a thing, and the brutal reality of revolt, a fire quickly and ruthlessly extinguished. But we also glimpsed the enduring human hope, the slow, determined saving of the peculium, piece by piece, leading to the hard-won dignity of manumission. Remember the freedman, the liberatus, who gained his liberty only to find his path still shadowed by his former master, yet whose children walked free and unburdened. The legacy of this system is not just in the marble ruins and the grand history books, but in the subtle, enduring questions about human value, labor, and the true cost of an empire built on human property. Take a deep breath now. Let the complexities of the ancient world recede, and rest easy knowing that the weight of those old Roman chains is long gone. Good night. Good night.